The shilling was in the air for less than a second, and every person in the long drawing room at Cranmere Park turned to watch it go up. Because a coin thrown by a gentleman is the funniest thing in the world to people who have never in their lives had to catch one. It came off the Honourable Crispin Danvers's thumb with a little bright spin. It went over the heads of two seated ladies who put their hands to their bonnets, and it fell towards the girl standing at the end of the third row, with her chin up and her gloves worn through at the fingers. There is no reason on earth why the ownership of 3.5 acres of England should have turned on the fact that Clemency Hale had spent 11 summers throwing a ball for a small brother against the wall of a naval cottage at Devonport. But it did. She put up her right hand without hurrying and closed it, and the room heard the clap of her palm shutting on the coin. And after that, nothing in the county of Wexbury went the way the Honourable Crispin Danvers had arranged for it to go. It was the 5th of March, in the year 1819, and the meeting had been called for 1 o'clock. The Duke of Harcaster's improvement of the town of Steepleford was to be laid before the gentlemen of the neighbourhood, and because the gentlemen of the neighbourhood had wives and daughters who were curious to see the inside of Cranmere Park now that the old Duke was dead, near on 200 people had come. They were given tea. They were shown, in the long drawing room with the 4 tall windows facing south, a beautiful coloured plan on an easel, drawn by a man from London who had never stood in Steepleford in the rain. The plan showed a new carriage approach coming up from the bridge in a fine slow curve, and a lodge with pillars at the foot of it, and a great sweep of open turf where the eye at present was obliged to look at something else. The something else was Paradise Row. It was 29 dwellings of soft red brick and 1 long slate roof that dipped in the middle like a horse's back, and it stood on 3.5 acres of the Duke's land between the churchyard wall and the river. It had been put up 130 years before to house the men who dug the fish ponds, and it had housed somebody ever since. And on the 5th of March 1819, it housed 141 people, which was a number Clemency Hale could give you, because she had walked it door to door in January with a slate, counting for the parish, for no money at all. The Honourable Crispin Danvers stood beside the easel with his hand resting on the corner of it. He was 28 and beautifully made, with red-brown hair brushed forward and the sort of laugh that other men copy without knowing they are doing it. He was the Duke's cousin. He had managed Cranmere for 6 years through the old Duke's long illness, and he had grown accustomed to a state of affairs in which his opinion was the only one anybody troubled to ask for. He explained the approach. He explained the lodge. He explained that the work would begin on the 15th of June, when the London men could come down, and he said, in the pleasant offhand way of a man mentioning a thing everybody has already agreed to, that the row would of course come down first, and that the tenants had been very properly warned at the last rent day, and were of no account in the business. Nobody in the room disagreed with him. 11 of the gentlemen present held land of the Duke themselves. 2 of them had already had the surveying of the new approach promised to their sons. The rector, Mr. Pelly, who had buried 8 of the Paradise Row people in the last 2 winters, and knew all their names, looked hard at the carpet, and said nothing at all. And afterwards he was honest enough to say that this was the worst hour of his life, and that he had done nothing in it. And in the 3rd row from the front, on the aisle, sat a young woman in a walking dress of faded moss-green stuff that had been let down at the hem, with a band of newer cloth showing where the lengthening had been done, and a shabby dark red cloth cloak pushed back off one shoulder in the heat of the room. Clemency Hale was 22. Her father had been Lieutenant Robert Hale of His Majesty's brig Alacrity, and he had gone over the side in a January gale off Ushant 4 years before, and with him had gone the half-pay, and the pension that a lieutenant's daughter gets is a thing you can carry home in one hand. She had a brother of 9 called Toby. They had the last house but one in Paradise Row, 2 rooms and a scullery, and she kept them both by writing letters for people who could not write, and by copying music for the 2 families in the town who had a pianoforte, and by teaching 4 children their letters at the kitchen table for $1 a week each, which is not a trade, and was not called one, and which nobody in that drawing-room would have thought worth the mentioning. She had not come to make a scene. She had come because Mrs. Lydia Ferrers, the doctor's widow, had a ticket and a carriage and no wish to sit alone, and because Clemency had wanted to see the plan with her own eyes, since half the row had been told one thing and half another. She sat through the tea. She sat through the approach and the lodge and the great sweep of turf. She sat through the sentence about the tenants being of no account. And then, in the small pause while Mr. Danvers was turning over the second sheet of the plan, she stood up. 200 heads came round. She was not a tall woman, and she was not a loud one, and she said quite plainly that she begged Mr. Danvers's pardon. But she had 2 questions, and the first was whether the row was to come down for the view or for the road, because the road on the plan did not touch it. And the second was what the ground was worth. There was a silence of the kind that goes into a room like cold water. Then somebody laughed, high up at the back, and once one person has laughed, the rest are given permission. And the laughter went round the long drawing room the way fire goes along a hedge. Crispin Danvers let it run. He was a man who understood the value of letting a thing run. Then he said, in a voice pitched to carry to the windows, that he was charmed to be catechized, and that he had not known the town of Steepleford employed a woman of business. He asked her name. She gave it. He said, "Ah, Hele," and looked at the ceiling, and said that he seemed to recall a Hele who had been drowned owing money in the town, and asked, generally, of the room whether that was the one. Somebody said it was. He said that he was sorry for it, and that everybody must be sorry for it, and that it did not alter the fact that the young person had asked what a piece of the Duke of Harchester's estate was worth, which was a question for a purchaser, and that she must forgive him if he did not immediately take her for one. The room enjoyed that very much, and Clemency Hale, who had gone white to the lips and had not moved, said, still quite plainly, that she had asked what it was worth, and that she was still asking. It was at this point that Crispin Danvers made the single mistake of his life, and he made it for the reason that clever men usually make theirs, which is that he was being funny, and the room was with him, and he wanted one more laugh out of it before he sat down. He said that since the lady pressed him, he would name a price, and that he would name it as a gentleman names a price, once, and stand by it. He said that the row and the ground it stood upon, 3 acres and a half freehold, the whole of it, was worth $4,000 of anybody's money, and that he would take $4,000 for it and be glad. He said that he would take it in 6 pences if she liked, in a barrow, since he supposed that was the manner in which such sums arrived in Paradise Row. He said that the offer would hold on, or before the day his men began, being the 15th of June, and that after 12 o'clock on that day she might have the bricks for what the carter would charge to shift them. And then, because the room was laughing again, and he was pleased with himself, and because there is a particular kind of gentleman who cannot leave a woman standing with her dignity about her, he took a shilling out of his waistcoat pocket, held it up between two fingers so that everybody could see it catch the light from the south windows, and said, "And here is your earnest, my dear, and something over for your trouble." And he threw it. He threw it the way a man throws a coin to a boy who has held his horse, high and careless, so that the boy must scramble. It went up over the two ladies in the second row. It hung. And Clemency Hale put up her right hand and caught it out of the air, cleanly, without a fumble, and the sound of her palm closing was the only sound in that room. She looked at it, then she held it up above her head, between her finger and her thumb, exactly as he had held it, so that it caught the same light, and she said, in a voice that carried further than his had, that she took his earnest, and that his price was $4,000, and his day was the 15th of June, and his terms were 6 pences if she chose, and that she had this whole room for witness. Nobody laughed at that. Not one person in 200. A bargain sealed by earnest money, passed from a seller's hand to a buyer's, before witnesses, in the hearing of everybody present, was not a joke in England in 1819, and the 11 farmers in that room knew it better than the 11 gentlemen did, because it was how they had bought every beast and every load of hay they had ever bought in their lives. You struck hands, or you passed a coin, and you said the price and the day out loud where people could hear, and then you were bound, and the man who tried to go back on it discovered that the county has a memory and no forgiveness. There was not a farmer at Steepleford Market who could not have told you that. Crispin Danvers had grown up in London. For about 4 seconds the Honourable Crispin Danvers's face was a study, and Mrs. Lydia Ferrars, who was watching him and not the girl, said afterwards that she had seen a man understand a thing and decide to laugh at it in the same instant, and that she would not have believed it could be done so fast. He laughed. He said, delightful, and clapped his hands twice, slowly, and said that the county had been vastly entertained, and that he hoped the young person would enjoy her afternoon. He turned back to the easel and asked whether there were any further questions, and there were none, and the meeting went on to the matter of the lodge pillars. But 2 things happened before the tea was cleared, and both of them mattered. The first was that a tall man in a plain dark coat, who had been standing all this time at the foot of the great staircase with his hat in his hand like somebody waiting to be told where to go, came forward 3 steps into the room. He was 31. He had a long face and grey eyes and a way of standing that made people take him for a land agent, and he had been the Duke of Harcaster for 4 months and 11 days, since his elder brother's horse came down with him at a gate in Leicestershire, and he had spent the 8 years before that doing nothing whatever of any consequence in a small house in Hampshire on 800 a year. He knew the names of no more than 40 people in his own county. He had not been asked to speak at his own meeting. He came forward those 3 steps with his mouth open to say something, and Crispin Danvers said, over his shoulder, without turning round, "Thank you, Harcaster. We have it all in hand." And the Duke of Harcaster stopped where he was, and shut his mouth, and did not say it. He was ashamed of that for 102 days, and it is fair to say that everything he did afterwards, he did because of those 3 steps, and the sentence he did not finish. The second thing was that as the room broke up and the ladies went out through the double doors to look at the orangery, an old man in a black coat, green at the elbows, crossed the whole length of the long drawing-room to where Clemency Hale was still standing, and took her hand and shook it once hard. He was Mr. Ezra Blount, attorney at law, of Cheap Street, Steepleford, 71 years old, 40 of them spent doing conveyancing for people too poor to be worth cheating. He said, "Do not lose that shilling. Do not spend it, do not put it in a purse with other money, do not let your brother see it. Put it in a twist of paper and put the paper in your shoe if you must." And then he said, "God help you, child," and went out to find his hat. Clemency Hale walked the 2 miles home to Steepleford because Mrs. Ferrars had gone on to Chalcombe. It rained on the last half-mile. She came into the 2 rooms at the end of Paradise Row with her shoes ruined and her hair down her back, and her brother Toby, who was 9 and who had been told to bank the fire and had not banked the fire, looked up from the hearthrug and asked what a duke's house was like inside. She said that it was very large and very warm, and that the tea was cold. Then she sat down on the settle with her wet cloak still on, and took the shilling out of her glove and put it on the table, and she and Toby looked at it. It was an old shilling, worn nearly smooth, with the king's head on it rubbed down to a shape rather than a face. It was, at that moment, the whole of the security she had for the roof over 141 people, and there were 102 days to go. Mr. Ezra Blount saw her at 8 the next morning, before his clerk came in, and he gave her the law of it in about 4 minutes, which was the kindest thing anybody did for her that spring. He said that a bargain for land made by word of mouth was worth nothing in a court, and that everybody knew it. He said that a bargain for land made by word of mouth, sealed by earnest money, passed from hand to hand, and spoken out loud before 200 people who could be brought to say what they had heard, was a different animal altogether, and that if she could hold him to the words he said, she would very likely have it. He said that this was not a matter of finding some old writing in a box. There was no writing. There never would be any writing. There was a thing a man had said in front of a room full of his neighbours, and there was a coin, and there was the county's opinion, and out of those 3 things a bargain either stood up or it fell over, depending entirely on whether the people who had been in that room were willing to open their mouths. Then he said the rest of it, which was worse. He said that of the 200 people at Cranmere Park, he could think of perhaps 30 who did not hold land of the Duke of Harcaster, owe money to a man who did, or want something from the family for a son. He said that on the 15th of June, when she came with the money, Mr. Danvers would look her in the face and say that he had never made any such bargain, that it had been a pleasantry, and that no gentleman could be held to a pleasantry, and that he would say it in a room where 9 people out of 10 would find something very interesting to look at on the floor. He said that he had watched exactly this done to better people than her for 40 years. She asked what would answer. He said, numbers. He said that one poor woman with a grievance is a nuisance and can be swept out of a room in a minute, but that a poor woman standing in a room with the money on the table in front of her, and the whole town at her back, and the sum made up out of the pockets of 1,000 people who all want to know what became of their sixpence is not a nuisance and cannot be swept anywhere at all. He said, get the money. Get it in the open, get it slowly, get it from as many separate hands as ever you can, and let every soul in the county watch you get it. The money is not the point, child. The money is the witness. She went out of Cheap Street at 9:15 with 101 days left and no plan whatever, and she did the only thing she could think of, which was to go back to Paradise Row and knock on all 29 doors and tell them the truth. They came out into the road. It was a raw morning, with the wind off the river and the washing frozen stiff on the lines behind the houses, and they stood among the puddles in the rutted lane and heard her say that she had bought the ground for $4,000, that she did not have $4,000, that she did not have $4, and that she had until the 15th of June. Nan Pruitt, who took in washing and had 5 children and a husband with a bad chest, went into her house without a word and came out with a stocking and shook it out onto her own doorstep and counted and gave Clemency Hale 9 shillings and 4pence, which was the whole of it, and said, now you have somewhere to start. That was the first subscription. Clemency wrote her name in a ruled copybook that had been meant for Toby's sums, and put the date, and wrote the amount, and then, because Nan Pruitt could not read, she read the entry back to her out loud in front of everybody. And that turned out to be the most important thing she did all spring, because word went round the town within a day that the girl read out every name, and after that, people came to be read out. By the Saturday, she had $41. She took the copybook and a deal table and a japanned tea canister to the market cross at 11 in the morning, and she sat there in the wind for 4 hours while the market went on around her, and she counted the whole of it out in front of anybody who cared to stand and watch. And then she read the names, all of them, from the beginning, which took 11 minutes. Then she said the total out loud, and the day of the month, and how many days were left, and she wrote all 3 of those things in chalk, on a slate, and hung the slate on the shaft of the cross, and went home. She did that every Saturday for 14 weeks. It became, without anybody deciding it, the thing the town of Steepleford did on a Saturday. The slate was read by people who did not subscribe, and by people who thought the whole business was folly, and by children who used the numbers to learn their figures, and by 2 commercial travellers who carried the story to Chalcombe and to Bristol, and eventually a great deal further than that. The Honourable Crispin Danvers took no notice at all for the first 3 weeks, on the sound principle that a thing you do not mention does not exist. Then somebody at the Wexbury Club asked him, in front of 8 men, how his sixpences were coming on, and he stopped taking no notice. What he did was efficient, and he did it without ever once appearing in the business himself, which is the mark of a man who has managed an estate for 6 years. At the spring rent day at Cranmere Park, Mr. Pinnock the steward, taking the rents in the estate room as he had done for 19 years, mentioned to certain tenants, pleasantly, in the manner of a man passing on a piece of household news, that his Grace's family took an unfavourable view of the subscription at Steepleford, and that leases fell in as leases do, and that a man with a young family did well to consider where his money was seen to go. He did not threaten anybody. He never said one sentence that could have been repeated in a court. Within 9 days, 11 families who had given took their names off the book, and Clemency Hale returned their money in the road in front of their neighbours without one word of reproach, and read the returns out on the Saturday, along with everything else, because she had said she would read everything. The bank at Chalcombe, where she had gone with $206 in a canister, declined the account. The manager was very sorry. The manager understood that there was some question of a dispute, and the house made it a rule. And in the second week of April a letter came to Mr. Blount from a firm of attorneys at Bristol, on behalf of a dealer in building materials, giving notice that their client had contracted with the Honourable Crispin Danvers for the whole of the lead, slate, timber and squared stone of a row of dwellings at Steepleford, the same to be taken down and carried away in the month of June, and that any interference with the said materials would be answered in the usual manner. Danvers had sold the row for salvage. He had sold it before the meeting for $600, and the money was spent. And that was why the row had to come down whatever anybody said about the road, and it was also, though nobody knew it yet, the reason he could not afford to take her $4,000 and be gracious about it. He had already sold the bricks twice. Clemency Hale did not have an answer to any of that. What she had was a slate on the market cross and a habit of turning up. She widened it. If the Duke's tenants could not give, then the money must come from people the Duke had nothing to do with, and so in the last week of April she began to walk. Chalcombe on the Tuesday market, 9 miles there and 9 back. The wool fair at Wexbury. The Tanyards at Ford. She had a plain form of words, and she never varied it, and she never asked twice. She said who she was, and what had been said to her in the long drawing-room at Cranmere Park on the 5th of March, and what she had answered, and what the price was, and what day it fell due, and then she said that she was not asking for charity for herself, that not 1 shilling would be spent on herself, that every name was written and read out, and that if the money failed of the price, every subscriber would have his own back to the last farthing, and that Mr. Ezra Blount had the keeping of it. Then she stopped talking, and waited, and it is a curious thing about that particular speech that it worked far better in a yard full of men than it did in a parlour full of ladies. The sums were small, and there were a great many of them. A blind fiddler at Chalcombe gave a shilling, and would not be talked out of it. The women of the Steepleford fish shambles clubbed together and sent up $2.08 by a boy. A farmer at Ford, who held nothing of the Duke, and hated him for a matter of a bull 20 years old, gave $40, and told her to come back. 3 of the London men, who had come down to survey the new approach, subscribed $1 each, and asked her not to write their names, and she said that she was sorry, but that she wrote every name, and they said, "Oh, then," and gave it anyway. Mrs. Lydia Ferrers sold a pair of earrings. By the 1st of May she had $1,318 and 45 days. And the town had begun to believe it, which was the dangerous moment, because a town that has begun to believe a thing will not forgive you for failing at it. Then May went wrong. Toby took a fever on the 9th and was very ill for 11 days, and Clemency Hale did not leave the 2 rooms at the end of Paradise Row for any of them, and the walking stopped, and the Saturday slate was chalked up by Mr. Tregarth, the bookseller, instead, with an apologetic note that the accounts stood as they had stood. The women of the row carried the nursing between them in shifts, and Nan Prowett sat up 4 whole nights, and Dr. Meade came 3 times and refused his fee 3 times. The boy lived, but 11 days had gone out of 102, and when she came back to the market cross on the 22nd of May with her hands shaking, the slate said $2,091, and there were 24 days left, and the arithmetic of it was in front of the whole town in chalk. That was the week the county decided she would fail. It decided it kindly, and in most cases with real regret. And it went on giving her shillings in the way that people give a shilling to something that has become a fixture. Crispin Danvers was heard at a dinner at Wexbury to say that he had been assured the young woman had got as far as 2,000, and that it was a most creditable performance, and that he looked forward to the 15th with the greatest good humour in the world, and that he would take the sixpences in a barrow himself, if she brought them. The story went round the county, and came back to Steepleford in 3 days, as such stories do, and it was that sentence, more than anything else, that put the fire into what came after. There is a particular kind of anger that a market town keeps for a man who laughs twice. It is worth saying exactly what the Saturday at the market cross had become by the end of May. Because it was not a collection, and anybody who called it a collection had not stood in it. The deal table went out at 11. The canister went on the table. The copybook went beside the canister, open, so that anybody who could read might lean over and read, and so that anybody who could not might be told. Clemency Hale did not ask a single person for money at the market cross in 14 weeks. She sat down and she counted what had come in during the week, out loud, coin by coin, and then she read the names from the beginning of the book to the end of it, every Saturday, so that a woman who had given 4pence in the 2nd week of March heard her own name read out in the 2nd week of June, along with everybody else's, and knew that her 4pence was still there, and had not been quietly turned into somebody's dinner. By May, the reading took nearly 40 minutes, and the town made room for it. The butchers held their calling. Mothers brought children to hear their own names come round. 2 carriers timed their departure by it. An old man named Gurney, who had given nothing, and could not have given anything, came and stood at the same corner of the cross every Saturday for 14 weeks, and listened to the whole of it with his hat off, and when somebody asked him why, he said that he had been 40 years in that town, and had never once heard the poor read out by name, for a good reason. The children of Paradise Row ran their own subscription, and would not be talked out of it either. They gathered rags and bones and sold them at Ford, and they took the toll of a pear tree in the churchyard that nobody had ever claimed, and they went along the river bank after the floods for anything a flood leaves, and on the last Saturday in May 9 of them came to the table together and put down $2.11 in a knotted handkerchief, and stood there furious with embarrassment while it was counted. Toby Hale, aged 9, had earned 3 shillings of it holding horses outside the Ram, and his sister wrote the names of all 9 children in the book in full, with their ages, because she said that in 11 years' time they would want the proof, and she was not going to be the one who left them out. There was one bad afternoon at Chalcombe in the 1st week of June that the county talked about for years afterwards, and it is only fair to Chalcombe to say how it ended. She had gone over for the Tuesday market with her canister, and a party of young gentlemen came out of the Angel after a long dinner, having heard who she was, and one of them, a boy of about 20, in a bottle green coat, thought that he would be witty in the way that his betters had been witty in March. He came across the marketplace and held a shilling up between his finger and his thumb where everybody could see it, and asked her loudly whether she caught, and threw it at her feet in the dirt. She did not move, and she did not look down at it. What happened next took under a minute and involves no violence whatever. Hannah Ivy, who sold butter and had a voice you could hear at the turnpike, put down her scales and asked the young gentleman his name. A carter got off his shafts. The blind fiddler stopped playing, which at Chalcombe Market was a thing people noticed the way you notice a clock stopping. Within about 40 seconds, there were upwards of 60 people standing in a ring in the marketplace, not touching him, not saying very much, simply standing and looking, and the young gentleman in the bottle green coat discovered that a market town can express an opinion without raising its voice at all. He picked his shilling out of the dirt himself, in front of all of them, which took him a long time because his hands were unsteady, and he went back into the Angel and had his horse brought round and left Chalcombe, and his father, who held a good deal of land and no small opinion of himself, sent $11 to Mr. Ezra Blount by a servant on the Thursday, with a note of 2 lines that Mr. Blount read out on the Saturday without any comment of his own, because the reading of every name was the rule, and rules that are kept when they are inconvenient are the only ones that count for anything. As for the Honourable Crispin Danvers, the county learned in the following winter, when his affairs were gone through, why he could not simply have taken $4,000 and made a graceful business of it, which is what any sensible man in his position would have done. He had been managing Cranmere for 6 years, and he had been settling his own losses out of the estate for 4 of them, in small sums at first, and then in sums that were not small, against rents not yet due, and timber not yet felled, and a salvage contract for a row of houses he did not own. He needed the row down, and the ground cleared, and the new approach begun, because a work in progress is the best possible cover for money that has gone somewhere else, and a finished account is the worst. $4,000 paid into the estate, in public, in sixpences, in front of 300 people, with an attorney at the table and a conveyance to be drawn, was the one thing in the world he could not survive, and he had brought it on himself at 1:30 in the afternoon of the 5th of March, in front of 200 witnesses, for the sake of one more laugh out of a room that was already laughing. Mr. Ezra Blount, who had guessed most of it by the end of April from nothing more than the shape of the salvage contract, said afterwards that he had watched a good many men ruin themselves in 40 years, and that the instrument was almost never a clever enemy. It was almost always their own mouth, on a good day, in a warm room, in front of people they were sure did not matter. What saved Paradise Row came in over the sea, and it came because of a commercial traveller in hardware named Josiah Pring, who had stood at the market cross at Steepleford on a wet Saturday in March, with nothing better to do, and had heard a girl read out 11 minutes of names, and had told the story that night at his inn at Chalcombe, and had gone on telling it at every inn between there and Plymouth for 11 weeks, because it was a good story, and it made him welcome at tables where a hardware traveller is not always welcome. At Plymouth in the last week of May, it was told at an ordinary in 4 Street, in the hearing of a one-legged gunner named Abel Cotterell, who had been at the wheel of His Majesty's brig Alacrity in the January gale off Ushant 4 years before. and who had seen Lieutenant Robert Hale go over the side after a boy who could not swim, and who had never in his life expected to hear that officer's name spoken in a public room again. Abel Cotterell could not write. He got a purser's clerk to do it for him, and he had a letter written to Captain Ossian Crewe, late of the Alacrity, on half pay at Stonehouse. And Captain Crewe, who was 63 and bored and had a good deal of time on his hands, took the thing up with the ferocity of a man who has been waiting 5 years for something to do. He wrote to every officer and every rated man of the Alacrity's last commission whose direction he could discover, and to 200 others besides, in 9 ports, and to 3 newspapers. He put it in the plainest form. Hale's girl is buying a row of houses off a duke for $4,000 to keep 141 people in them. She has raised 2,000 of it herself in the open, in sixpences, in a marketplace, and she is going to be short, and I am not going to be able to sleep if she is short. Send what you can spare to Ezra Blount, attorney, Steepleford, and he will read your name out in the market on a Saturday. It began to arrive on the 4th of June, and it arrived for 6 days. It came in orders and in notes, and twice in coin sewn into a shirt. It came from Portsmouth and Deptford, and Leith and Cork. It came from 163 men who had served with her father or with somebody who had, and from 11 widows of men who had not come home, and one of the widows sent 4 shillings and a note to say that it was for the boy that Mr. Hale went in after, who had been her sister's, and who was alive, and a cooper at Bideford. The whole of it came to $940, and Mr. Ezra Blount, who had not wept in public since the year 1799, read the names of the ships at the market cross on the Saturday, and got as far as the 4th of them, and had to hand the book to Mr. Tregarth, now the Duke of Harcaster. He had gone home from his own meeting on the 5th of March, and had not slept, and on the 6th he had sent for the papers of the Steepleford improvement, and had found the salvage contract in 3 minutes, because it was on the top of the pile, because his cousin had never imagined that he would look. On the 8th, he had told Crispin Danvers to release the young woman from the bargain, and let the row alone, and Danvers had laughed at him with real affection, which was worse than contempt, and had explained that the money for the bricks was spent, that there were other matters spent besides, and that his Grace, who had been a duke for 4 months and could not name 40 people in his own county, would oblige him by attending to the shooting. So the Duke of Harcaster did the only useful thing that was left to a man in his position, and it took him 9 weeks. He could not give her the money. Mr. Blount applied to privately in his own back room in Cheap Street, was blunt about it. He said that the moment 1 shilling of Harcaster money went into that canister, the whole business became a gift from a duke to a pretty girl, and the county would say so within the hour, and Mr. Danvers would say so for the rest of his life, and every one of the 1,100 people who had given a 6pence would have been made a fool of. He said, "Your Grace, the only thing you have that is worth anything to her is the thing you did not do on the 5th of March. So he went and found the witnesses. He rode out through his own county for 9 weeks, mostly alone, and he called on farmers and clergymen and half-pay officers and 2 brewers, and a great many people who had never had a duke sit down in their kitchens. And he asked each of them the same question, which was whether on the 15th of June, in a room in front of everybody, they would stand up and say what they had heard with their own ears on the 5th of March. Most of them said no. Some of them said no and could not look at him. 11 said yes. And in the course of 9 weeks of being told no by his own tenants, the Duke of Harcaster learned more about the way his family's land was managed than he had learned in the 4 months since he inherited it, and he never afterwards had to be told anything about it twice. He met her 3 times that spring, and it was never arranged, and never longer than a quarter of an hour. The first was in April, in the rain, at the Cranmere lodge gate, when he got down and opened it for her, because the lodge-keeper was at his dinner, and she thanked him, and went through with her canister under her cloak, and did not know him from any other man in a wet coat, and he stood in the road, and watched her out of sight, and then rode home the long way. The second was in the churchyard at Steepleford in the last week of May, 4 days after Toby's fever broke, when she came out of the porch and found a tall man reading the stones along the north wall, and he asked her, without any preliminaries at all, what her father had been like. She told him. It took 10 minutes. He listened the way people listen who have decided in advance not to say anything, and at the end of it he said that his own brother had been the one everybody liked, and that he had discovered that a man who inherits the place of somebody better loved will spend the rest of his life being compared, and that he supposed she knew about that. And she said that she did, and they stood in the churchyard for a while and said nothing further. And she went home and did not tell anybody, and neither did he. The third was on the 2nd of June at Tregarth's, the booksellers in Cheap Street, where he came in and found her copying music at the back counter for a shilling a sheet, and he asked her plainly what he could do that would not spoil it. And she thought about it and said, "Be in the room on the 15th, and stand up." And he said that he would. And she said that she was very much obliged to him, and that was the whole of it. On Saturday, the 12th of June, the slate on the market cross said $3,813, and 3 days. There was no more to get. Every hand in Steepleford had been in every pocket in Steepleford 4 times over. The sailors' money had come and been counted. The wool fair was over. The last Saturday's take was $14 and some odd, and it was made up of nothing but sixpences and pennies and 1 silver thimble, and Clemency Hale chalked the figures on the slate, as she had chalked them for 14 weeks, and stood back and let the town read that she was $187 short with 3 days to run. The town read it and went quiet and went home. And on the Sunday night, the 29 households of Paradise Row met in the road between their own doors. Without her, because Nan Pruitt had gone round in the afternoon and told them to. Every family in that row had been under notice since the last rent day, and every family in that row had money put by to move with, because you cannot move without money, and a great deal of it was money that had been saved a farthing at a time for a year. They put it in the middle of the road on a scrubbed board, and when they had done it and counted it, there was $194 and some shillings on the board, and it was every penny they had to go anywhere else with, and if the bargain failed on the Tuesday, they would be turned into the lane in the last week of June, with the roof coming off behind them and nothing whatever in. Their hands. They gave it to her on the Monday morning at her own door, and Nan Pruitt said, "We have all talked it over, and we would sooner be ruined on your side of the road than the other, and Clemency Hale sat down on her own step in front of all of them and cried for the only time in 102 days. The 15th of June was a fine hot morning. The Honourable Crispin Danvers had made an occasion of it, because he made an occasion of everything. And there was a breakfast at Cranmere Park at 11 for the county, and the London men and the carts and the dealers' foremen from Bristol were assembled in the lane behind the churchyard to begin at noon on the roof of the first house. And there were near on 300 people in the great hall at Cranmere when the doors were opened, which was more than had come in March, because by that date there was not a soul in 3 counties who did not know what was to happen at Steepleford at 12 o'clock. She came up the avenue at 11:30 behind a hand-barrow. It was the barrow he had asked for. The town had thought of it. Job Sturge, the carrier, pushed it, and it carried 4 canvas bags of coin, and a japanned tea canister, and the ruled copybook, with 1,142 names in it, and behind the barrow came Mr. Ezra Blount, in his best coat, with the bank paper, for the part that could not sensibly be carried, and behind Mr. Blount came about 400 people from the town of Steepleford, walking, who had shut their shops. They came into the great hall, and it took a long time to get them all in, and the county in its silk stood back against the panelling to let them come, and Clemency Hale walked up the middle of that hall in the faded moss-green gown with the band of newer cloth at the hem, and stopped in front of the Honourable Crispin Danvers, and said that she had come to pay for the row, and asked where he would like the money put. He said that he did not understand her. She said the sum out loud. $4,000, the freehold of Paradise Row and the 3 acres and a half it stands upon, on or before the 15th day of June, the day named by himself in that house, before the whole room, and the earnest taken in her hand. And Crispin Danvers smiled at her with enormous kindness, and said, before 300 people, that he was afraid there had been a very great misunderstanding, that the young woman had taken up a light remark made at a public meeting in a spirit of pleasantry, that no bargain for land had been made or could have been made, that he would not for the world have had her put to so much trouble, and that if she would leave her direction with the steward, he would see that a subscription was got up for her out of the family's own pocket by way of making amends. It was very well done. It was so well done that for perhaps 10 seconds it worked, and the county on both sides of that hall made the small sympathetic noise that a room makes when it has decided to believe the comfortable thing. Clemency Hale said that she had no writing. She said it clearly, and she said it twice. She said, I have no writing, sir. There is no paper. There never was any paper. What I have is that you said it in this house, in that room, through those doors, with the sun coming in at the south windows, on the 5th of March, in the hearing of 200 people. And you gave me your earnest with your own hand, and I have kept it. And then she turned round and faced the hall and asked, in a voice that shook for the first time in 102 days, whether anybody present had heard him say it. And nothing happened. For 4 or 5 seconds, which is a very long time in a full room, nothing happened at all, and every one of the 400 people from Steepleford understood that they had been at the meeting in March in exactly the numbers of about 11, and that the rest of that room belonged to the Duke of Harcaster's family, and always had. Then Mrs. Lydia Ferrez, doctor's widow, of Chalcombe, 68 years old, stood up out of a gilt chair near the front, and said, I heard him. Then Mr. Tregarth the bookseller stood up. Then the Reverend Mr. Pelly, who had looked at the carpet in March and had not slept well since, stood up and said, in a voice nobody in Steepleford had ever heard him use, that he had heard every word of it, and that he had held his tongue at the time, and that he did not propose to hold it any longer. Then a farmer at the back, called Gribble, stood up, and then the 2 Ford men beside him. And then a man got up in the middle of the hall who nobody could see properly, and then 11 more, and the thing went along the room the way the laughing had gone along it, in March. And it did not stop for a while, and when it did stop there were 31 people standing up in the great hall at Cranmere Park, who were prepared to say in front of the county that the Honourable Crispin Danvers had named a price and a day, and had thrown a shilling at a girl to be rid of her. And Crispin Danvers, who was not stupid, looked round the room for the one man whose word would end it, and found him, and said, Harcaster, for God's sake, tell them. And the Duke of Harcaster, who had come 3 steps into a room in March and had been told to be quiet, and had been quiet, stood up in front of everybody he owned and everybody he did not, and said, I heard him say it. He named $4,000 and the 15th of June, and he offered to take it in 6pences, and he gave her the earnest out of his own waistcoat pocket, and I was standing at the foot of that staircase, and I said nothing, and I have thought about it every day since. The bargain is a good bargain. It will be kept in my house. Then he told Mr. Holloway's, his attorney, who was standing at his elbow with his mouth open, to draw the conveyance that afternoon, freehold, in her own name, and to bring it to Paradise Row himself, and not to send a clerk. They counted the money on the long table under the south windows, and it took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and nobody was allowed to leave. They counted it in 6pences because he had asked for 6pences, and the 6pences were counted into piles of 40 by Mr. Blount's clerk and by Job Sturge, and by 3 of the London surveyors who took their coats off and joined in without being asked, and every so often Clemency Hale read out where a sum had come from. Because 1,142 people had a right to be present in that room, whether they were in it or not. 9 shillings and 4pence, Nan Pruitt of this row, the first money given. $2 and 8 shillings, the women of the fish shambles. 1 shilling, a blind fiddler at Chalcombe, whose name I never got, and who would not give it. $940, 163 seamen and 11 widows, of the Alacrity and 8 other ships, $194, the moving money of the 29 households of Paradise Row, given on Monday last. At 20 minutes past 2, the total on the table was $4,007, and the whole room heard it, and the noise that went up out of 400 people from a market town in the great hall of a ducal house was heard by the carts waiting in the lane behind the churchyard, who packed up and went home. Clemency Hale took the $7 off the table and put it in the canister for the roof, which needed it. Then she took a twist of paper out of her shoe, which is where Mr. Ezra Blount had told her to keep it 102 days before, and she unfolded it, and she walked round the end of the long table to the Honourable Crispin Danvers, and she put the worn old shilling into his hand, and closed his fingers on it with her own, in front of the county, and said, Your earnest back, sir, I am paid up. I would rather not owe you a coin. He left the county in September, and did not come back to it. The conveyance was brought to the last house, but one in Paradise Row by Mr. Holloway's on foot, as directed, at 7 in the evening on the 15th of June, and the whole row came out to look at it, and Toby Hale, aged 9, was allowed to hold it for a minute, and was not allowed to hold it for 2. They stripped and relaid the long slate roof that autumn out of the roof canister, and the dip in the middle came out of it, and it has never dipped since. The rents were set at what the families were already paying, and not 1 shilling more, and were collected on a Saturday, and the arrears of anybody sitting up with a sick child were dealt with by the simple expedient of not mentioning them. Nan Pruitt had the tenancy of the end house for her life, at a rent of 1 shilling a year, which the row voted for by a show of hands in the road, and which Clemency Hale was not permitted to argue about. The new approach to Cranmere Park was built the other way, round the far side of the churchyard, where it cost more and looks better, and the man who surveyed it was one of the 3 who had taken his coat off to count 6pences. And in October, the Duke of Harcaster came down the row on foot, with his hat in his hand, and asked the freeholder, formally at her own door, in front of Nan Pruitt and about 9 children, whether a person who had stood in a room for 3 minutes was allowed to subscribe to a roof he had spent 9 weeks failing to save. And Clemency Hale looked at him for a while and said that he might buy slates, and that he might carry them himself, and that the town would want to see him do it. He carried slates up a ladder in Paradise Row for 2 days in his shirt sleeves, in front of the entire population of Steepleford, and that, in the county of Wexbury, was the beginning of it. There is a shilling nobody thinks about any more, in a pocket somewhere in London, worn smooth, with the king's head rubbed down to a shape rather than a face, and there is a row of 29 houses under 1 long straight slate roof, between the churchyard wall and the river, with washing out and the doors open in the warm weather, that a young woman in a mended gown bought for $4,000 from a man who thought her not worth answering, because she put up her hand and caught what he threw at her.